What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane and asks the question, what if? I'm your host, Jim Montgomery. Welcome to episode 3 of season 2. We are officially in full playoff mode here in Philly. If you want more on the daily updates on how the Eagles are preparing for this week's game against the Giants, be sure to check out my daily This Day in Philly Sports History podcast, where we take a look at things that happened that day in Philly sports history. I typically will give a recap of what happened the night before to either the Flyers, Sixers, Eagles, during baseball season, the Phillies, and that type of thing. So be sure to check that out wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. But as I mentioned, it is playoff season in the NFL, and especially here in Philadelphia as we're preparing for the Eagles versus the Giants. And I would say maybe like the past 10 years or so, 10 years post Andy Reid, I guess it would be almost at this point, 11 years or so. It's not been the same as it was with Andy. With Andy, when he was here, typically you knew every year they were going to make the playoffs, or at least be in the hunt for a playoff spot. And in most times, they would be one of the teams that could make a run and possibly win a championship, at least make it to the NFC Championship game. Since then, we do have the Super Bowl, which is going to come back up here later on in the show. But it's been sort of hit or miss. With Doug Peterson, after the Super Bowl run, that the Super Bowl year was their first year back, and then they did make it a couple years after that, went through a little bit of a dry spell, and now they're back 2 years. So it's been different, though, because I feel like that first year in the playoffs, they knew like they were the number one seed, obviously, and we felt good going into that, even though Carson Wentz was hurt. The other 2 years, I mean, some people still think that the whole Alshon catch, or non-catch, I should say, against New Orleans, that would have made a difference. I'm still not so sure, but whatever. Last year, they had no shot. The year just was that it was fool's gold. We talked a little bit about that last week with our playoff preview. But this year, things are different, and I'm anxious to see where this goes. But I'm going to take it back to those Andy Reid days, because he's basically done the same thing now in Kansas City, and it's hard to believe that he's been in Kansas City almost as long as he was in Philly. I think he was here 14 years and ended up, he's been in Kansas City since. So I believe his last year here was 2013. So this is his 10th year in Kansas City, which is just mind-blowing. But they've consistently been a playoff team in his time there. And they're the team that capable of making a run. They've gotten there a couple times. We'll get more into the reasons why they got there. But the common read, obviously, between the Eagles and the Chiefs when Andy Reid was here was Andy Reid. So if he's the common denominator, what makes him so polarizing, I guess, here in Philly? Because I feel as though Buddy Ryan is beloved, and we've talked a lot on both of my podcasts just about the Buddy Ryan teams. And you have Andy Reid, who had a lot more sustainable success than what Buddy did, and he just doesn't get the love that he deserves. I mean, I would argue that Doug Peterson, rightfully so, because of the Super Bowl, gets way more love than what Andy Reid does. And I think part of it is because he was here for so long. But for me, it's because that was the most disappointing. I shouldn't say disappointing. Let me rephrase that. The argument could be made that which is the more disappointing era of Eagles football? Is it Buddy versus Andy? Like, which one was more disappointing? And you can make the argument, but as far as I'm concerned, and I've talked about this a lot of times on here, so I don't want to get too far down the Buddy Ryan rabbit hole, but for me, it's Buddy Ryan. He's way more disappointing than the entire Andy Reid era, and I'll tell you why. It's because Buddy never met his expectations. Those expectations were high. with that defense, there's no excuse, no reason why they should not have won at least a playoff game. And like we said, they had the one division title, 0 playoff wins in his 5 years in Philly. Andy Reid got the Eagles close. I feel like sometimes he overachieved, sometimes he underachieved. Buddy's teams, I feel, always ended up underachieving for whatever reason. But with Andy, they were always there. And like I said, like sometimes they went on that run, sometimes they didn't, but you always had a belief, no matter how good or bad the regular season was. So my argument is that Buddy was more disappointing. Andy Reid was more of a frustrating time because that potential was there. And you saw them get close numerous times. And with Buddy, he never got there. So I think that's why it was disappointing. And also why sometimes we put him way more on a pedestal. So why don't we put Andy Reid on the same level or higher than Buddy Ryan when Andy Reid has actually achieved things in Philly? And they could have done it any year when he was here. And even when they lost, we always knew, well, they'll be back. And we'll get into that because what I want to talk about today is not specifically the entire 14 years, but his record in the big game itself, in the NFC Championship game while he was in Philly. And to look at that, it's kind of like you have to see where it started. He came in, he picked McNabb as his number 1 pick or the number 2 overall pick, and he was riding or dying with Donovan and had some growing pains that first year. 2000, that's when they got hot and were able to sneak into the wild card and actually win a playoff game before losing. So coming into the 2001 season, they had some high expectations. It seemed as though, even though they still struggled with the Giants, it was almost, you could sense the changing of the guard, where the Giants were sort of the cream of the NFL or the NFC East, and the Eagles were the up-and-comer. And 2000 was when they were probably, I would say, on equal footing. So it was their second straight 11-win season. Happened to also be our first season as season ticket holders. So I feel as though I am very qualified to talk about the Andy Reid era because I was at majority of those games. And there's probably, I can count on one hand the number of games during that whole tenure that we missed. But it was their second straight 11-win season. They actually won the division for the first time. So they were actually able to overtake the Giants, had some success in the playoffs. They beat the Buccaneers at home. Then they went to Chicago and beat the Bears, who were, I think, the number 1 seed that year. Or may have been the number 2 seed. Either way, they were better than they should have been. And so all of a sudden, you have this team that Andy Reid's in his 3rd year. Donovan is in his 2nd year as the starter, and they're in the NFC Championship game. And at the time, the Rams were the greatest show on turf, but they were not where they were 2-3 years before when they won their first Super Bowl. So they go in there, and I think going in with 0 expectations, they had nothing to lose. They were playing with house money, if you believe in that type of thing. And they were up 17-13 at halftime. Then the Rams kind of woke up and realized who they were. The Eagles did get it down to like a 29-24 lead with just under 3 minutes, I think, but couldn't pull it out. Donovan had them driving, and I think he threw an interception or a ball was tipped or whatever it was. They came close. Obviously, they weren't ready to beat the Rams yet. However, as a team, they gained so much playoff experience that was going to serve them over the next few years now at this point. So going into the 2002 season, the expectations were through the roof because, all right, we had made it. You could see the I can't say this, I messed up before. The natural progression where, okay, getting your experience. First year, you get into the playoffs, you actually win a game, which accelerated, I would say, the expectations a little bit. The following year, you win the division, get to the NFC Championship game. Boom, what's the next logical step? Because now you have the Rams taking a step back almost. and there was a lot of changes going on. They were still good, but there was some things. I believe that after that, that was the year where Mark Bolger and Kurt Warner, it was sort of they were battling. So you're coming into the 2002 season with those expectations, and it was an eventful season to say the least, and a special one because it was the last season at the Vet. So what better way to send out the Vet than going to the Super Bowl? So they went 12-4 again, won the division for the second straight year. That was the year, if you remember, Donovan broke his leg against the Cardinals through the 4 touchdown passes, and then we had like a combination of Coy Detmer and A.J. Feely, who just kept the ship afloat. I think they lost one game through that whole stretch that McNabb was out, still clinched the number 1 seed. So they had the bye. They beat the Falcons in the divisional round. Donovan was able to shake some of the rust off. Very eerily similar, I think, because it was a Saturday night game, and I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but that was a Saturday night game. You had your quarterback coming in, some concerns because he was injured. How would he look? Everybody thought the Falcons were a dangerous team. They won, I believe that was the year they won the first ever home playoff game in Green Bay. Came into the Vet, Michael Vick, how are they going to stop him, this, that, and the other, and they just basically dominated. Not too unfamiliar, or not too unsimilar, I should say, to what we're getting ready to experience this weekend with the Giants. So just kind of throwing that out there. But then they beat the Falcons. Tampa Bay came in. So it was the last game at the Vet. And if you do listen to This Day in Philly Sports History, this was today specifically is the anniversary of this. But the last game at the Vet, Tampa Bay came in 1-22 all time in their history when the temperature was under 40 degrees. And the one time they did win was, I think it was this team, and they beat the Bears, but the Bears were 4-12. Or whenever they beat the Bears, they were 4-12. And whatever that number is, the 1-22, it was way worse when the temperature was below 32. So kickoff in this game was 26 degrees. I remember it being cold, but we were having fun. We were not worried about it. So Brian Mitchell takes the opening kickoff, 70 yards, gets tackled. Deuce Staley, 2 plays later, takes it in from 20 yards. Eagles are up. Crowd is going nuts. I talked about it this morning. I ended up 3 or 4 or 5 rows back. I don't know how I got there. So you got a 7-0 lead within the first minute of this game, and things were looking good. To me, I still will go to my grave, and I mentioned this morning, so if you listen to that, I do apologize for the overlap. But if Brian Mitchell would have returned that kickoff for a touchdown, that whole game plays out much differently than the way it did. So after that, it was all Buccaneers. You had the Joe Jurevicius play where he beat, I believe it was Levon Kirkland and Blaine Bishop, who were both later on in their career, and basically set up a touchdown, and it just never was the same after that. The lasting memory of that was the whole Rondé Barber interception, returning for a touchdown. And I still will say I never left a game after a loss where it was so quiet and just everybody was in shock. And this was probably the year that you kind of started to think that maybe Andy's snake bitten, because he had gotten there 2 years in a row, and the year that you're favored against a team that doesn't win in the cold. But going to the offseason, new stadium, most of the team was going to come back again, and here we go. So 2003 season, still disappointed, but now you got a nice new, brand new state-of-the-art stadium. They go 12-4 again and win the division again. So you can see that they were kind of dominant. I mean, you had the Giants every now and then that would give them a run. You had Washington, who I don't know if they ever really had above a 500 record during this time. And then you had the Cowboys, who every now and then would push them a little bit. But during this run, the Eagles were just basically, you knew they were going to win the division. This year they started off 0-2, and I remember the opening of the link. it was just everybody was hyped up. Rocky was there and everything. They shut the lights off. It was just this big celebration, and then they just got blown out by the Patriots, which wasn't good. But they started off 0-2. They were almost going to fall to 2-4, but this was the year of Brian Westbrook's Miracle of the Meadowlands, when for some reason they punted it to him and he just went. And whatever he did that game, it ignited them. They won 9 of their next 10. This was also the season of 4th and 26, where they were almost ready to lose. And then 4th and 26, McNabb hits Freddie Mitchell. They go down and kick the field goal, send it to overtime. Eagles win. I still will say that play would have been way more iconic had they won than what it is. Now it's more of like a footnote because they didn't do much after that. But I think it would have been up there with the Philly special and Bryce's home run had they gone a little bit further. I think, to be honest, if the team wins, that basically trumps everything, because I feel the Philly special would have been just a footnote if they did not win that Super Bowl. But they make it all the way back to the NFC Championship game again, and I think at that point, after 4th and 26, there was a sense, and I remember for me anyway, I felt that this team, okay, they finally are going to exercise these demons. Yeah, this is now their third straight trip to the NFC Championship game, but look at how this season went. Like, come back from the dead 0-2, almost getting ready to go down to 2-4 and probably not be able to win the division. Miracle of the Meadowlands, where Brian Westbrook returns that punt, go on and win. Not looking good against the Packers. 4th and 26, convert, win that game. I think going into the Panthers, because they were an upstart. They were, I forget their record, but they had a losing record the season before. So we're like, all right, yeah, we'll take it. Unfortunately, McNabb hurt his ribs in that game. It was kind of a questionable, may have been a cheap shot. He tried to play through it. He couldn't get through it. They just kept throwing interception after interception. Didn't matter whether it was Coy, Donovan, whoever. The defense played fairly well in that game, and I think it was there for the taking. They just couldn't get anything. Carolina's defense also played well. Funny story about that game, I had bought champagne the year before in anticipation of celebrating against Tampa. At that point, I was still living in the city, so I still drove to the games because it was only like $20 to park. It wasn't the $60 or whatever it is now. So kept that champagne until the next year. Brought it down, was ready to do it. Got so mad, went back. I never forget it. There was 3 bottles, and I went to slam them down to break them because at that point I felt that they were just jinxed champagne bottles. And it was another cold game, and went to do the first one. It bounced, and no lie, I threw it, hit off the blacktop, bounced up, and this was a glass bottle, right back into my hand. Like, I've never seen anything like it. God rest his soul, my buddy Scotty Balls was right there and was like, Jimbo, what the fuck was that? Did you just throw that? I'm like, yeah, and it bounced in my hand. So it pissed me off even more, so I got to throw it down even harder, still wouldn't break. It didn't bounce back up into my hand, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. They literally were jinxed champagne bottles. Finally, I was able to get them to break. I think I ended up bashing them again. Not the smartest thing to do. Probably should not have been driven. I was driving. I was young and stupid at the time, so don't send me hate mail about this. But definitely curse champagne. But the fact that I threw it, it bounced right back up into my hands, and Scotty saw it. So unfortunately, he's not here with us anymore to confirm. But he saw it, and it was the craziest thing ever. So that was that. The next offseason was an interesting one, though. And I think what made us kind of believe and realize was, all right, they need some playmakers, because in this game, it didn't matter whether it was Donovan or Coy. They couldn't get anything. So they needed to get some receivers. They had some decent running backs. They had B. West. They had Deuce, who I don't know if Deuce was there that year, but Buckholder. They had guys to run the ball, but they didn't have really the receivers. You had guys like Greg Lewis, Todd Pinkston. I don't think Thrash was on this team, but it was just like, for whatever reason, Andy just never believed in putting a premium on receivers. So T.O. and Donovan played in the Pro Bowl that offseason, said they wanted to play together. San Francisco had a trade in place. I forget exactly the details of how this worked, but I think he was traded to Baltimore, but then somehow Baltimore traded him back to the Eagles. It was like it was messy, but T.O. kind of forced that trade. So you had T.O. coming into the 2004 season with the team that had already been to 3 straight NFC Championship games. And in that season, I think the other missing piece that everybody talks about Andy, he for whatever reason, middle linebacker and receivers. And this was back with the Eagles. I know he does things a little bit differently now, except for he did let Tyreek Hill go. But middle linebacker, they got rid of Trotter. Had Trotter been there in 2002, I doubt that Joe Jurevicius would have gotten away for that 71-yard run. And then all of a sudden, we're talking that game's different. Because after that long pass, even though he didn't score, things just weren't the same. So they re-signed Trotter that offseason. It's kind of like Andy saying, yeah, I fucked up. But I think the other underrated signing they had that offseason was Javon Curse, who was an all-pro with Tennessee, came in and definitely made a difference on that defense, playing alongside of Hugh Douglas, Corey Simon, and those guys. So that team was a lot of fun. They rolled through the season 13-1. Then they rested their starters and lost 2 games. And until this year, they were the franchise's best team from a win-loss perspective. Or I guess they were the first ones to go 13. They won 13 and 17 too. But T.O. got hurt that year on the horse collar by Roy Williams, had the miraculous comeback, did not play in the playoffs, but they beat the Vikings in the divisional round. And then all of a sudden, here come the Falcons back. And it was just kind of like the Eagles' coronation. Everybody just knew that the Eagles are finally going to win. And I don't necessarily think that game was ever close. And finally, he won the NFC Championship game, which was great. But then they lost to the Patriots in the Super Bowl, which, I mean, was it Spygate? Was McNabb hungover? Was it time management? Was T.O. the problem? We're going to get to that in a second. But needless to say, they finally did make it over the top. And trust me when I say there will be more episodes and more ways to dissect that Super Bowl specifically. All of those things we have. So don't want to get into that because this is strictly on the NFC Championship, and they actually won that year. And then you had the 2008 season with the Cardinals. They were 9-6-1, last wild card. That was when they needed like the most ridiculous things to happen in order to make the playoff or to even have a chance to make that game mean something. They all happened, and they had to play the Cowboys and just thumped them 44-6 to make the playoffs. They had a Thanksgiving Day game at home. That was the McNabb tie. I think he got benched the end of that game too, or end of one of the games. Then they beat the Vikings on the road, went and beat the Giants, who were the number 1 seed on the road, lost to the Cardinals in the NFC Championship game, and another game that could have been won. They were down big at halftime, came back, had the lead in the fourth quarter, and then the defense couldn't hold it. And I guess the common thread in the Rams NFC Championship game, yeah, the Rams were the better team, but the Eagles were in that. They weren't getting blown out. Tampa Bay, yeah, they ended up getting blown out, but for the most part, that game was a 10-point game for most of the second half. They just couldn't get anything going. They needed a spark or something. The Panthers game, that was another close game, which you could just tell that like you needed one thing to spark, whether it was the defense getting a score or a running back breaking a long run. Obviously, they won in 2004 against the Falcons, but even that Cardinals game, they had the lead in the fourth quarter. So it's not like Andy's coming up and getting blown out in these games. It's not like how, if you look at the Bills when they would go to the Super Bowl, where they were never in those games, with the exception of the first one against the Giants. But like you knew it was just a foregone conclusion the Bills were going to lose. The Eagles at least and maybe this isn't a good thing, but they sucked you in with the hopes and thinking that they could win it, only to, I use the analogy a lot of Lucy taking the football away from Charlie Brown when he's getting ready to kick it. So the what if for this is we got to take 2004 out of it because they actually won, but we'll have way more on the Super Bowl coming up. That was the year he finally broke through, but I don't want to. I want to treat that as a separate thing because there's so many issues in that Super Bowl, and we'll get to it. But you got to take each year differently. And if we start with 2001, it's like, what if they would have beaten the Rams? I don't think they were ready for primetime yet. So if they would have beaten the Rams and gotten to the Super Bowl, were they ready to be there yet? I don't know. I mean, Tom Brady, that was his first year as a starter too. And, I mean, I think he came in week 3 whenever Drew Bledsoe, I forget what he even did. Was it his spleen or his lung or something crazy like that? But I don't know. Was Brady ready for prime time? Would there have been would it have been a different universe? Is there a parallel universe where Donovan McNabb is Tom Brady, all because he broke through and beat the Rams in that game? I don't know. It's hard to imagine that, but it's also hard to be mad at that year because of how young that team was. So that one I'll give them a pass. But I feel like there is somewhere, some way, a universe where they did go in and it changes the whole trajectory of Tom Brady. It changes the whole trajectory of Bill Belichick, the Patriots, all of those guys, Andy Reid, Donovan. There's so many different butterfly effects to that game. But like I said, it's hard to be mad about that because that was, again, if you talk about a natural progression, and the league was different then. Now you can go out and have a couple good, get a good draft class, give them a year or two, sign a couple big free agents, and then boom, you're going from 4 to 12 to 12 to 4, or I guess now it'd be 12 and 5 or 13 and 4. But it was a little bit different back then. You still kind of had that. You kind of grew as a team and took those progressions. So that's that. So for 2002, I mean, the what if they beat Tampa Bay? There's so many in that game of how they could have. And to me, this was the year. There's so many what ifs, like what if Andy felt differently about linebacker? And that is, to me, what ultimately cost them that game. Yes, the defense played well for the most part after that, but man, you can't let Joe Jurevicius open for 70-some yards. And LaVon Kirkland, he was a great player when he was in Pittsburgh. He was 175 years old when he played for the Eagles. They had no business playing there. And Blaine Bishop was 165 and couldn't catch up to him. So if Trotter was there, you didn't let Trotter leave to go to Washington, maybe we're having a different conversation. What if Brian Mitchell returned that kick? At that point in his career, he definitely had lost a step. I mean, and I don't think it's wrong to say that. Brian Mitchell 5 years before, 1997 Brian Mitchell, 1995 Brian Mitchell, takes that to the house. That changes the whole complexion of that game because you get all hyped up. That's demoralizing to a team. So it didn't happen, and we know what happened. And I think this one could be on Andy, could be on Donovan. I don't know, but what if they didn't crumble after they went down 10-7? I feel as though, okay, you went up 7-0, Tampa comes down and ties it, then they kick a field goal, and the Eagles did tie it back up, but I just remember having PTSD going back to this game. It's just you could tell they were just oh shit, this team's not going to fall over. And I think that comes to the coaching. You got to get your team ready. Okay, just because you're up 7-0 1 minute into the game doesn't mean the game is over. And that aspect of it, I will put on it. I keep wanting to call him Andy. As far as I'm concerned, they would have beaten the Raiders. I really think that was the team. And I think they could have been on the cusp of starting a dynasty had they beaten the Raiders because you go back now to 2003 and it's what if McNabb didn't get hurt on a cheap shot? And okay, so McNabb doesn't get hurt. They beat the Panthers and play the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Could they have beaten them that year? Absolutely. They 100% could have beaten the Patriots that year. The way that defense played that year, they could have beaten them. And all of a sudden now there's a possibility now you could have won 2 Super Bowls in a row with those Andy Reid's teams. And am I disappointed about those 2 years yet? No, I'm not disappointed. I'm pissed off. I'm frustrated, which is the key difference between Buddy and Andy. And the question I have to say is, then 2004, they bring in T.O., and sort of the whole bottom of it falls off. So another question that kind of pops into my head now as I'm like kind of thinking about this, and were they a better team without T.O.? I mean, they were getting there right on the cusp without him. The defense was playing lights out. The defense, they had Javon Curse coming in 2004. Could they have gotten over the hump and beaten the Falcons without T.O.? I don't know if they beat the Patriots, but you never know. But think about what happened in the aftermath of that. McNabb got jealous of T.O. Could Donovan have handled that better? Absolutely. Look back on our episode list. I covered that. McNabb is just as much to blame as T.O. Everybody wants to blame T.O., but McNabb played a huge part in this, and T.O. was not innocent. Like, I'm not saying it was all on McNabb, and like maybe we can go back and I can do a part 2 of that episode, and it could be the first ever part 2 of Back to the Future. You know what? They do Back to the Future 2, 3, whatever. Maybe I can do Donovan versus T.O. part 2. And see, like, what if they never signed him? How would the trajectory of that team have looked? And what would McNabb's numbers look like? I think it's worth a conversation. Especially because in 2003, they were a good team who basically their quarterback in the biggest game of the season got hurt with a cheap shot. So we'll see. 2008, I think this was, other than 2002, I know of the teams, the 5 teams to make it to the NFC Championship game under Andy Reid. This record-wise, this was the worst team. But I feel talent-wise, this was the year, other than, obviously 2004 had the most talent, but I think 2002 was the year they had the best shot to actually win a Super Bowl. 2008 was very, very close being up there. And I know they were 9-6-1. They were the 6th seed, barely got in, got lucky to get in. But they were much better than their record that year. They were just inconsistent. They battled injuries. It was just like a mess that year. But I think if they would have held on to beat the Cardinals, they would have beaten the Steelers. And you might call me crazy, but, and I've talked about this site a lot, and some of the things I do for my research, I go to this site all the time. WhatIfSports.com. I simulated this game 10 times. Actually, I did 12 because 2 of them, they turned out to be ties. I'm not sure why. I guess I didn't program it that it was a Super Bowl. But the Eagles won 60% of the time. The Eagles went 6-4 against the Steelers with those 2 ties, and the 4 losses were defensive struggles where the Steelers won by 3 points or less. The Eagles had a couple blowouts in there. So nobody's going to tell me that they weren't going to be able to beat that Steelers team. That was not the most talented Steelers team, in my opinion. The one with Jerome Bettis in his last year, that was the better team, I think. Even the one in 2006 when they lost to Green Bay, that was a better team. The Eagles would have beaten that team had they been able to hang on against the Cardinals. So all of this, and I know this started off with Andy Reid, but like the question becomes now, is this Andy Reid's problem? Is it a Donovan McNabb problem? Because Donovan was the starting quarterback in all 3 of them. And everyone's very, very quick to blame Donovan. And he was inexperienced in the first one. They played one hell of a game. Again, it's hard to be disappointed in that. Donovan can take some of the blame in the Tampa game, but your coach needs to have that team ready. That game's not over when you go up 7-0 with 14 minutes left in the first quarter. And I feel like that's what they all thought. And like I said, it kind of sounds funny, but it's true. Like, I still cringe when I hear that. 2003, it was a cheap shot. He got hurt. There's nothing you can do. And I mean, just like Wentz got hurt that year against Seattle, it was a cheap shot. I mean, what are you supposed to do about something like that? They got over the hump the following year in 2008. I still don't think that's McNabb's fault. I mean, he put up 25 points. Your defense cannot give up 32 points. Yes, it's Larry Fitzgerald. Yes, it's Kurt Warner. You cannot give up 32 points in the NFC Championship game and expect to win. So I'm not going to put that one on Donovan. But everybody who says, oh, yeah, so going back to the original point, everybody's like, oh, Donovan, it's Donovan's fault. It's not Andy Reid's fault. What did Donovan do, or what did Andy do after Donovan left? He never got back to the NFC Championship game with any of the quarterbacks he had coming in after Donovan left. So can you put that one on Donovan? And if you think about it, when he went to KC, he didn't do much his first 5 years there. He didn't do anything, and he choked. He pulled the same Andy Reid stuff, losing in the playoffs, until Patrick Mahomes became the starter. And Patrick Mahomes is like a freakish player, a once-in-a-generation type guy. And even with him, he still has found a way to lose in the AFC Championship game. And he did win his Super Bowl, but he lost another one. So I do think that it's a legitimate question. Like, everybody wants to say this is Donovan, but no, this is the Andy Reid versus the NFC Championship game. This is an Andy Reid issue. Why couldn't Andy Reid get that team over the top? And I mean, look at what he's done. And it wouldn't be like he seems like he's giving like Patrick Mahomes, and this is going to sound like I'm whining, but sure, he's learned, but he's giving Patrick Mahomes these weapons and allowing him to do his thing. Did he hold Donovan McNabb back? I mean, the question's there. I mean, should he, like, McNabb, trust me, I will, he shoulders a lot of the blame, but does he need all of it? No. And did Andy Reid hold Donovan back? And I can't believe here I am in the Andy versus the NFC Championship game. I've already come up with 2 spin-off episodes. So that's how incredible and how intricate, I guess, this whole 14-year period with Andy Reid was. Did he hold him back? And I know there's a lot of questions about that, but I got to point out, like, yes, Mahomes is a very talented, freakish, once-in-a-generational player. But he's given him guys like Tyreek Hill. He's drafted better than what he did in Philly when it comes to this. And look at what's happened. And the defense, he's focused on some of the spots on defense where he let go when he was in Philly. Hence Trotter in that 0-2 game. So, I mean, it's worth looking into. And to me, that's why it's way more frustrating than disappointing. Buddy Ryan is disappointing because they didn't win anything. You knew that they had potential to do it. They just never did. So it's kind of one of those things like, oh, man, yeah, like you tell your kid who is like your high school senior who's 5'5", sure, you could be a superstar in the NBA. How many guys in the NBA 5'5" are successful? That's, to me, sort of what the whole Buddy Ryan era was. Yeah, we thought they could, but they didn't. They didn't come close to doing it. Andy Reid is the 6'7" power forward who can dribble, shoot, rebound, who's like 260 or 235 and doesn't want to practice or doesn't want to go into the weight room. Like, it's frustrating because the talent is there. You should be one of the top players, but you're not putting in the work. They could have been what the Patriots were during that stretch. They could have been a dynasty, but for whatever reason, Andy held them back, whether it was with his personnel decisions, some of his coaching decisions, even in the Super Bowl, and I don't want to get too much into that because this is the NFC Championship, but his coaching decisions in the Super Bowl sucked. Did he hold Donovan back? Should he have stepped in sooner with T.O.? Should he have given him other weapons before that so it didn't come to what it did? I don't know. And it's frustrating. I get so angry thinking about all of those teams because And like I said, I was there and I lived it. I breathed it. I was a huge part. There was a huge part of like the beginning of my first 14 years of having a season ticket, or 13 years, was Andy Reid's team. And it's angry. It's frustrating. You just want to like reach out and shake him. Like, what were you thinking? What were you doing? Like, you should have. There's no reason why they shouldn't have won at least one Super Bowl, if not two, maybe even three. And like, that's not even me wearing the Kelly green or the midnight green glasses or drinking the Kool-Aid. That's legitimate. You don't have the number one seed 3 straight years with the NFC Championship game at home as a favorite and only win one? Come on now. But that's disappointing? No, that's fucking frustrating as shit. With Buddy Ryan, it's like, oh man, it's like they were so close, man. Maybe next year. And it's like you get your hopes up and it's disappointing. With Andy Reid's team, your hopes were there. Your expectations were high, and it was Lucy with the football. There was no Lucy with the football with Buddy Ryan, minus the fucking fog ball, and I still get pissed off about that. But now you got me fired up, going in. Like, I just want to go tackle Andy Reid and draw a mustache on him. But tell me what you think. Was Andy to blame for all of the lack of winning in the big games in Philly? Was it Donovan? I'm telling you right now, my vote, Andy Reid. Please let me know what you think. Send a comment, send me a text message, leave a message, like, subscribe, whatever. I mean, is Buddy Ryan's a more frustrating era than Reid's? Like, am I using the the wrong adjectives? And then again, let me know what you think about that. Which is worse, Buddy or Andy? I'm telling you, Buddy, disappointing. It's kind of like, oh, shucks. But Reid, it's like, fuck you, dude. Like, you were there multiple times. There's no excuse for it. Get your ass in the weight room and practice. And then something else to think about. Give me your thoughts on this. Were the Eagles actually a better team without T.O.? Would they have been better off without him in the 2004 season? And would McNabb have stayed? Would it have changed the trajectory of that team? Would they have gotten to more NFC Championship games only to have Andy Reid choke? But I don't know. Be sure to like and subscribe this, whether you're on Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts, YouTube, everything, every like, every listen, every comment. So please leave comments, even if it's on YouTube. Let me know your thoughts on some of those questions I asked. Was it Andy, Donovan? Which era was more frustrating? And truthfully, I think I'm going to go further with this question. Were they a better team without T.O.? And I think it's legitimately worth having the conversation about. Be sure to check me out each morning on Back to the Future. This is Back to the Future with a PH. Thank you for listening. But be sure to check me out each morning on This Day in Philly Sports History, where we recap what happened that day in Philly sports history, as well as take a look at the current events and the status of the state of the current Philly sports situation. We're going to get more into this weekend about the Eagles-Giants. Next week, to me, it's a very special episode I'm looking forward to. I kind of been working on some things because we're going to cover a very important person in my life. We're going to take a look at the career of John Chaney. It's the anniversary of both his birthday and his death. I've been looking forward to talking about this because I'm not sure if I mentioned this on here or not, but I have had the opportunity to meet him on many occasions, so I'm looking forward to just kind of going on and talking about Coach Chaney and everything. So be sure to check for that next Thursday. Be sure to follow me on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Jimbo_Mont. Check me out on Instagram at Philly Jimbo. If you're on Facebook, hit me up there too. But again, leave comments. Let me know what you think, because I want to get a dialogue started about this, because to me, like I said, there's no more frustrating era in Eagles sports, Philly sports history than Andy Reid's Eagles and Andy versus the NFC Championship game. Why couldn't he defeat the Dragon? But go have yourselves a good week. Let's go Birds. Hopefully next Thursday we're getting ready for the NFC Championship game. And until next time, I'll see you when I see you.